It's an honor to introduce the plenary that we were all looking forward to. Professor Ruth Defries has been the family professor at Columbia University, New York, since 2006. She was elected to the United States National Academy of Sciences in 2006 and received the prestigious MacArthur Genius Award in 2007, among many other accolades. Professor Defries has changed the way scientists study land use change. Using satellite images, she has shown how changes in land use can affect ecosystems and the climate. She has also taught us how tracking anthropogenic impact at large spatial and temporal scales is fundamental to support sustainable land use decisions. Her contributions to understanding of tropical deforestation, fire, carbon emissions, and food security are an invaluable legacy that paves the way to the science community at large. We have among us a scientific giant. Please help me welcome Professor Ruth Defries.
Thank you for that kind introduction. This conference has just been fabulous. The integration of people, business, and biodiversity was a fabulous framing, and the implementation completely lived up to the title. So I applaud the organizers and so much appreciate what you've done in thinking about conservation in such a progressive and forward-thinking way. And I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. I realize I'm between you and a big glass of cold beer. So what I wanted to do today in this closing plenary is to bring up a couple of issues that maybe didn't come up during the last couple of days. But to start with, going back to the beginning, when Eric gave his plenary, he had some words of wisdom, which was to answer tomorrow's questions, not today's questions. So I want to start off with a picture here that illustrates to me what tomorrow's questions are. This is a picture which is just down the road from our research site in central India. Some of you might recognize it. And one building is coming down and another building is going up. What's coming down is the traditional mud houses that people have lived in for a very, very long time. And what's going up is a brick and concrete modern kind of house. There's a bit of prosperity in this village because it does benefit from tourism around a tiger reserve. And it's been such a rapid transformation and a positive transformation. I personally love the mud houses. I don't have to live in one. The concrete houses are less maintenance. It's what people aspire to. And people are now more and more able to fulfill their aspirations. And that's great. And it also raises new questions for conservation. How do we think about conservation with this new prosperity? We heard from Harini about urbanization as a new frontier for conservation. Harini referred to the very strong dynamic that is going on in the world. We heard this a lot in the sessions, at least the sessions I went to, that the urbanization that's occurring in the world isn't just within the cities. It's having a big reach. So here's a farmer in this same landscape in central India who was telling us about her traditional farming, very integrated, very knowledgeable, lots of traditional knowledge. And she was telling us that she's the last farmer in her line, that her daughter is studying college, her son is off in the town doing some labor, and they are not going to be farmers. We are seeing a very, very different rural landscape where there's less and less agricultural labor and less people farming in traditional ways, and the urban pull is very strong. And that changes the landscape and has a lot of impacts for the way we think about conservation. I wanted to start here and show you this graphic, which you might or might not be familiar with, which is the best news of the century that gets the least coverage. There has been such a dramatic decline in the number of people, the proportion of people and the number of people living in absolute poverty. This is a fantastic human achievement. If we think just 200 years ago, which was not very long ago, almost everyone, 94% of the population in the north, in the south, in the east, and the west, everywhere, was living in absolute poverty. And we go to today, and that number is less than 10%, and a rapid decline in the last couple of decades. This is something that we should be this is a very laudable achievement for civilization. We tend to focus on all the bad things that are happening, but this is a very different world and a better world for many, many people. I could spend my whole hour up here showing you statistics about declines in infant mortality, increases in life expectancy, increases in education, all kinds of positive indicators that the world is a better place for a lot of people. And Asia has a lot to do with that. So this is a histogram. So on the x-axis is per capita income, and it's a log scale. So people on the left, your left, are very, very poor, and people on the right are wealthy. And you can see the poverty line there, defined as $1.25 US per day. So this is a situation back in 1988. How many of you were born in 1988 or sooner? A lot of people. And I think young people. My son was born in 1987. So I think about this as what has happened in your lifetime. It's incredible, really incredible. So in 1988, we see sort of what you would expect about inequity in the world, where there's a few people on the wealthy side of the histogram and a lot of people living in poverty, and many of those people in Asia, China, and India. And we go 5 years forward. We have, of course, increase in number of people, but we have a slight shift to the right. So what we want to see is a shift to the right, people moving out of poverty, people increasing their income, and we want to see a peak, so less inequality. So we go, oops, the 5-year jump here. There we go. By 1998, moving to the right here, particularly China, 5 years onward, even more moving to the right. By the time we get to 2008, we're seeing some pretty big shifts. And by 2011, we're even losing the bimodal distribution and more and more people living decent lives, meaning above the level of extreme poverty. What remains is the 10%, and that's a really hard 10%. So what the economists say is it's going to be a lot harder to bring that last 10% out of poverty than it was to get this far. And most of the remaining poverty in the world is in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and in many of the places where you work in the biodiversity hotspots and the rural areas. But this is really a fantastic, fantastic human achievement that we should all be proud of, and we should, that's our future, and it has a lot of implications for conservation. So Georgina Mace, I don't know how many of you saw this paper in Science a couple of years ago, where Georgina Mace traced out the changes in the way we think about conservation, going back to the 1960s, which was very much based around scenic areas and protecting wilderness, through to kind of a protectionist kind of way of thinking about conservation, towards ecosystem services, and towards the people in nature, the socio-ecological systems, the resilience kind of thinking that we've heard so much about at this conference. I would argue that if we we go forward a little bit, the next step in the way we think about conservation is, how do we change our view about conservation with this new prosperity, which hopefully will extend to more and more people? How does that change the way people think about nature? How does that change the way that conservation can be done? How does it change the way people manage their resources? So it's a different world. It's a different world for conservation now than it was, and it's a better world for many, many people. And we have to think about how conservation and the new prosperity can benefit both conservation and people. So if we think about what are the concerns with prosperity, with poverty, there are lots of concerns. Basic needs, food, water, just basic needs. As people get more prosperous, they can think more about issues like health, human health. Invest more in human health. Invest more in energy, not just one light bulb from the ceiling, but energy for a modern lifestyle. Infrastructure, mobility, roads, enough water, food diversity, reducing food insecurity. All of these issues around prosperity. Then we have our conservation concerns, which we all care very deeply about, biodiversity and climate. So where's that intersection point? That's not the only areas of intersection in conservation. We have to think about reality, political will, ability to implement, and how do we find that kind of sweet spot? So there's lots and lots of talent in this room and lots of passion, but we have to face it, we are a tiny community compared with other communities in finance and business and so on and so forth. So how can we think about the science that we do that addresses that sweet spot, what people care about as they become more prosperous, that addresses the conservation issues that we care about, and that has some degree of reality in making some changes on the ground. So I want to give you a couple of examples of trying to find that sweet spot, and I'm giving you examples from my own lab. Not that those are the best examples, and certainly not the only examples. There have been a lot of wonderful talks today about great work that's really aiming at that kind of sweet spot. But I'm going to talk about those because those are the examples I know the best, because it's the work that we've carried out in my lab. Two examples, one in Southeast Asia, frontier landscapes, rapid change, and another in South Asia, which is a very different, long settled landscapes, the opposite of frontier. So within Asia, there is such a vast heterogeneity of the kinds of conservation questions and the kinds of landscapes that we face. So to start with this example, the fires and human health in equatorial Asia. Many of you are from the region, so you know what this is about the haze. So here's a picture from NASA, which shows the region blanketed in smoke last year, associated with the dry conditions of strong El Nino and the fires that occur. So you all, a really bad haze episode. The haze episodes happen regularly every year, but during an El Nino year, they're particularly bad because the fires are particularly severe. So, big political issue, enormous economic impact. There have been estimates of the economic impact of closed airports, lost productivity, closed schools, all kinds of fallouts from this haze episode, not to mention the public health impact on the air that people were breathing during that time. If we zoom in, we see these fires coming off the landscape. So, of course, this got a lot of press attention. It didn't really get the press attention in at least in North America, from what I could see, that a real public health crisis like this deserved. but there is a lot of press looking at calling attention, you need to call attention to it because everyone was breathing it, to this haze crisis last year. And this is what appeared in the New York Times on the front page about orangutans, which is great to call attention to the issue. I thought it was a little bit insensitive to focus on the orangutans, not that they're not important, but so many people being affected, children being evacuated, I think we care a lot about people as well as the orangutans. Every crisis has to have a culprit. And the culprit that came out of this crisis is the oil palm. So here we have these beautiful, luscious oil palm seeds, which we talked a lot about at this conference. And as Eric said a few days ago, there's such a polar view about oil palm. In the West, it's demonized as ravaging rainforests and clogging hearts, and in Asia, it's so lucrative. It's worshipped as bringing fortunes, and it indeed has. It has certainly brought fortunes to big companies. But what we all sometimes don't recognize is that oil palm has also pulled a lot of smallholders out of poverty. Malaysia is the middle-income country that it is today, largely because of palm oil. So these very black and white views, as we all know, tend to obfuscate the real issues. But the reality is that the demand for oil palm is not going away, will only increase. We've seen it increasing for the last few decades, and it will very likely continue to increase with increasing prosperity and demand as for diets and the many other products that oil palm is used for, cosmetics and industrial products and all kinds of things. So that demand isn't going anywhere. So this crisis, oil palm was the villain. So article after article called out the oil palm, not just oil palm in general, but the oil palm companies as being the cause for this really terrible haze crisis that had such a big public health impact. Except for one article, which went back and looked at what do we know about this? What do we know about the contribution of oil palm to the haze problem? And that was our colleague, Eric. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about what we've learned about this, this question, the facts on Indonesia's haze problem. And we've had part of what Eric was relying on other people's work and our work that we've been doing for a couple of years now. I've had the privilege of being part of a very interdisciplinary team of atmospheric chemists and modelers and public health experts and epidemiologists to address or see what we can understand about the contribution of land use in Southeast Asia to haze and public health impact. So we started this project, it was a while ago, we started the project thinking that this public health aspect is not one that we ordinarily focus on when we think about palm oil and land use change in Southeast Asia. A lot of the discussion is around the climate impact from the peat emissions, the carbon that gets into the atmosphere, or the loss of biodiversity, or orangutans. But this public health aspect really wasn't getting enough attention, we thought, at the time, and that perhaps there's some intersection point between achieving some good for public health and achieving some good for conservation. So we put together this team, and we found out a lot of sort of interesting things. The first very obvious thing is that Singapore is just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You all should just pick up and move. Sumatra and Kalimantan, where there are so many fires and emissions happening, and Singapore is just smack in the way of that. The arrows here indicate the wind direction. So Jakarta doesn't get any of this. Jakarta is upwind. So maybe the situation would be different if the wind was blowing the other way and Jakarta was getting the impact of the fires. But it's just an unfortunate geography for Singapore. And to make it even worse, the peat, which is where most of the emissions come from, is just right across the channel there. So the emissions are not only blowing straight to Singapore, but the really big emissions from the peat are right there in proximity. So, so the peat, as I'm sure you are all well aware, is enormous stores of carbon that for development, for plantations or agricultural activities, needs to be drained, just like the prairies in North America were drained as the settlers went across and planted wheat and corn and soy. And when the peat gets dried, it's just a tinder box. It can just burn and burn and burn for months. So the peat is right there in the wrong place from Singapore's point of view. So we asked just a couple of really step back and ask some really basic questions. Sometimes in our science we like to answer the really, really complicated questions, but we wanted to step back and just get an understanding of the situation. So one question is, where are the fires occurring? So the assumption would be, oh, they're occurring in the oil palm plantations because, of course, they're the culprit that are contributing to this haze problem. Well, we found something very, very different than that, as other people have found as well, and I think there have been some presentations during the last few days on this as well, that actually most of the fires are occurring on non-forest land. So here, so we did this work before the event in 2015. So 2006 was the last El Nino, so you see the spike there. And we see that most of the fires, so these are fires which are observed from satellite, which is not perfect, but provides a lot of information. That most of the fires are occurring on what the Indonesian Ministry of Environment calls non-forest land. So that non-forest land is kind of a catch-all for agricultural mosaics, which could include smallholder, different types of plantations and different types of agriculture for smallholders, degraded lands, all kinds of mosaic kinds of landscapes in there. And what we found was for 2006, the last El Nino, that the industrial plantations were certainly a contributor, definitely a contributor, but not the main contributor. That 31% of the emissions from Sumatra and Kalimantan came from industrial plantations. That leaves a lot of other emissions coming from these non-forest sorts of mosaic areas. So that makes it a little bit harder. So Eric told us also that folk working with the big companies is there's more leverage there than trying to work with many smallholders. So this makes it a little more challenging to deal with the fire problem, but that is the reality. So if we assume that stopping the fires on just the industrial plantations, and certainly just on the oil palm plantations, that's not going to solve the haze problem. Second question is, within the industrial plantations, is it right to put all the blame on the oil palm plantations? So how do these different types of plantations contribute to emissions between the logging, oil palm, and timber concessions? And here again, we found something a little bit surprising that goes against all of those newspaper articles, that that on Kalimantan, the oil palm concessions were contributing 67%, this is again in 2006, contributed 67% of the emissions. But on Sumatra, it was the timber concessions that were contributing the bulk of the emissions. So some of these timber concessions may have flipped over to oil palm, not exactly sure about that, but they were designated as timber concessions. So again, these kinds of myths that get perpetuated by the media don't often hold up to facts. So that's one of the key contributions that we can make as conservation scientists, is just to try to get the basic facts here. Another slightly more complicated question is, which are the fires that are contributing to human exposure? So fires that are upwind and the emissions are blowing to population centers are the places where you'd want to control fires more than those places where the emissions blow out to sea or don't affect a lot of people. So for this, it's been really interesting working with the atmospheric modelers who have these wonderful tools. This is the GeoSchem model, and there's part of the GeoSchem model is called this adjoint model, where you can basically trace backwards. You can see where are the places, if you're in a site, any site, Singapore or KL or wherever you are, which are the places that are contributing the emissions that you would feel in that site. So that leads us to this kind of sensitivity map. Obviously there aren't fires in the ocean, but if there were, where are those emissions going? So by combining this sensitivity map with the emissions themselves, we can say, where are the fires coming from that are affecting Singapore? Or where are the fires coming from that are most affecting any receptor site? So those are the fires that you'd want to target. So then applying these tools to 2015, we can then say, for Singapore, for example, where are those fires that were contributing most to the exposure in Singapore? Or if you're in Indonesia as a whole, where are the fires that are affecting Indonesians? Or where are the fires that are affecting Malaysians? And what came out of this analysis, comparing 2006 and 2015, was that, first of all, 2015 was a lot worse than 2006, which I'm sure you all know, if you're in this region. But that if you were going to target one place to reduce the fires, it would be South Sumatra to get the biggest public health benefit. So this is kind of a tool to target. Now this is a tool that might be useful. Not to say that it is currently useful, but if it can be integrated into policymaking, it could be useful to identify, given scarce resources for firefighting and fire management, where those could be allocated to get the best public health benefit. The other interesting conclusion that comes out of this analysis is the number of excess deaths, according to the epidemiologists, who then can take once we have the emissions, you see where those emissions go and how many people are exposed, and then from that exposure, estimate the excess deaths from respiratory illnesses and cardiovascular. That the number of Indonesians affected by this haze episode is far greater than the number of Singaporeans. Now, this gets a lot of attention in Singapore, but the number of people is far less, which says something about the prosperity, where the attention goes when people are more prosperous. So that's a tool that we can use. Now the question is, okay, we know this, so what do we do about it? So here's a call again in the newspaper that, okay, since oil palm concessions are the culprit, RSPO has as one of its criteria to not use fire. So step up the certification of palm oil firms and the problem will be alleviated. Well, we know that's not exactly the case, given how much of the emissions come from outside palm oil concessions. But let's ask the question, were fires less frequent? Is that a viable strategy? If you think about the RSPO, the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, and we look at certified plantations versus non-certified plantations, based on the record from 2012 to 2015, which is the data that were available, is it true that certified plantations had less fire than non-certified plantations? And this was an analysis done by a student who just finished, Megan. So she looked at this question for fires in all of Sumatra and all of Kalimantan, and the data is really, really poor on the concession boundaries and on which, or the available data is poor, which concessions are actually certified. But we pieced it together as well as we could to come up with a sample of certified plantations and non-certified plantations, and then match them according to distance to road, size, and various other factors to ask that question. Do we see an effect of the RSPO? So the answer was, if you club all the fires together, no, we didn't really see a difference in certified and non-certified plantations. But that's not really the story. We have to break it down by, are there less frequent fires in certified versus non-certified plantations when there's a big risk for fire? So the biggest risk for fire is during dry years, like an El Nino year, in the peat. That's where you're going to get most of the emissions. And the least emissions, or the lowest fire risk, are going to be in wet years in the non-peat. So is there a difference in the effect of certification if we break it out into this? And what we found here was that, yes, we did find a significant difference between the certified and non-certified plantations, but only in the lowest fire risk case, in the wet years on non-peat areas. In the high risk, the dry years in peat, and the other medium risk categories, we didn't see any significant effect. But I'm going to take this as a hopeful result that it is possible for the RSPO to have an effect to reduce the fires. It's just when it gets really, really hard to control the fires during the high-risk fire years, then we don't see the effect, which says to me that these kinds of criteria can be effective, but there needs to be more resources going into the firefighting. So my point here is that these are very, very basic questions. Where are the fires occurring? Which types of plantations are contributing to the emissions? Where are the fires that are contributing to human exposure? Kind of basic. And these facts matter. We can play a big role in just getting the basic facts. People won't always pay attention to them if it doesn't fit their worldview. But eventually facts do matter, and facts do catch up with us. And I think facts will even catch up with Donald Trump at some point. But they do matter, and that's what we have. That's our bread and butter, is that we have evidence and facts. So we, I think, as conservation scientists, need to always remember that we can really be helpful, even though it might not seem like people are paying attention, to just getting the facts straight, as Eric says. But also, we see how much attention went into this haze crisis, and for good reason, because it had enormous public health impact. And that's what most people care about. We care deeply about conservation, but most people care more about the haze than about conservation or about the climate emissions from the greenhouse gas emissions from the peat. And that is just the reality. So to the extent that we can combine our conservation concerns with what most people care about, even though we might think that they should care about the things that we care about, the reality is that they don't. So given our limited resources as conservation scientists, how can we find those intersection points? And public health is important in its own right as well. So I want to switch now to a very different landscape and a very different issue, but still related to prosperity and development. So there's no country in this world that has developed without a solid investment in infrastructure, in roads, in airports, in moving things around, in rail, in energy grids. And that's the process of development. Bill Lawrence had this paper a few years ago calling attention to the impact of roads, and all of these dark places are roads, so you can see Asia is very dense. But 10, 20 years from now, it's going to be a lot more dense. Most of the infrastructure that will occur has not yet occurred. And this is positive. This is what development needs. This is part of the development process and part of this new prosperity. But as we've had many sessions throughout the last couple of days, there's a huge conservation concern with how, where to place this infrastructure to maintain connectivity for wildlife. So connectivity is important for wildlife. It's important for people as well to move goods and services and people. So that's a basic development issue. So I want to take this issue to the landscape where I work, which is one that I have a lot of personal affiliation with, and we've had actually a lot of talks about Central India during this last couple of days, so that's been great. And as you've heard, India has 5% of its land area under some sort of protection, and these are very small protected areas and cannot capture the range of species which need to larger landscapes. But stepping back from that, it's just amazing to think that India, a country of 1.2+ billion people, with 5% of the land area under protection, has the wildlife that it has. It's just astonishing. And it goes back to the attention that was put and the wildlife protection measures that were put in place many decades ago. I know we all look at that situation with a lot of gloom, but if we step back a minute, we should appreciate how much wildlife there is, given the incredible amount of human pressure. So this landscape of Central India is where Rudyard Kipling wrote about. So you can think about Mowgli running around this landscape. And recently Disney put out a Jungle Book. So in Disney movies, there's always a happy ending, but it's not quite sure how or whether there will be a happy ending for this landscape, because it's under a lot of development pressure, being right there in the center of the country. So any infrastructure, any highway that's moving goods from west to east or north to south has to cut right through the center. And there is a lot of focus by the current government on economic growth, infrastructure, and that really is what needs to happen for development. So we've talked a lot about connectivity, but this is really not a new idea. This goes back to the 60s, to the first World Conference on National Parks, recognizing that protected areas will never be able to capture the scale of the ecological processes that we would want to capture, that we are always in a situation where the landscape is the unit that we really need to be thinking about for effective conservation. And very, very true in the Indian context. So here we have, zooming into this landscape, we know from genetic work that's been done, presented here, and published, that there are functional corridors in this landscape for large carnivores. And I forgot to mention that this is a landscape that is a globally important tiger conservation area. It's also high human population density and very poor area, tribal populations, and in real need of development and sharing in some of that prosperity that those statistics show. But there is functional corridors in this landscape, and they're basically in the forested areas that are left where there is some topography. So any place that is that can be used for agriculture or other uses is used, but there are these remnants of forest. So you can see the bits of forest between some of these protected areas, and somehow or other, these large carnivores, tigers and leopards, and we heard about sloth bears today, are making it across this landscape, and it's pretty hostile territory. Lots of agriculture, small-scale agriculture, rain-fed agriculture, lots of human settlements, and lots of new features that are coming up that are of major concern for maintaining this connectivity. For example, highways, lots of unpaved roads getting paved and roads getting widened, which are severing the connectivity between protected areas. There's a particularly politically charged example of that I'll get back to in a minute. Industrial zones, again, important for development. Coal mines, this is a coal mine region, and that's only going to increase with the increasing demand for energy. Power plants, tourism, which is a real double-edged sword, because tourism has increased dramatically in India, and it's a lot of domestic tourists, a lot of Indians who are now appreciating their biological heritage, which is wonderful, but it's really squeezing many of the protected areas. So for a long time, the conservation community has just said no to all of these infrastructure projects, to proposals for roads or proposals for power plants and so on. Just said no, 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 no. And with the new government, that doesn't really work. So it's been a hard lesson, but I think a lesson that a lot of people are taking very much to heart, that to just oppose these very important and real development needs is only going to lead to your voice being marginalized. That the thinking now is much more around, okay, we know that these infrastructure projects are important, and we certainly know that they're going to happen one way or the other. So how can we make our science useful to not just oppose, but help think through how best to accommodate these infrastructure needs in landscapes such as this? So, for example, modeling that Trishna Dutta, who's sitting right back there, has been doing to try to identify where are the important parts of the landscape, where are the bottlenecks in the connectivity, where are the places where you would want to avoid infrastructure projects, or where are the places you would want to restore to maintain or enhance connectivity. And where are the existing barriers? So there are a lot of existing barriers, and as infrastructure expands, there are going to be a lot more barriers that get in the way of all types. So how do we think about being helpful with our science, with identifying the places that would most improve connectivity for the least amount of investment? How do we think about different options, overpasses and underpasses and so on, to mitigate the impact on connectivity? So that's been a real shift in thinking, from opposing, sort of old style, just saying no, to how do we be helpful? How do we recognize that these infrastructure projects are actually really important for development, and how can we be a part of this dialogue? And it's not easy. It's not easy, but there has been a real shift, I think, in the thinking. So there's a lot of media attention around this issue. Also, one particular highway, National Highway 7, which bisects two very important reserves, probably the most functional corridor in the country, has been a lot of back and forth. And this is where that hard lesson has been learned, that it's better to be in there from the beginning with viable solutions that get you partway. There was a session earlier about compromising and imperfect is better than the worst case scenario. And a lot of these lessons have been played out in this particular case. But when we think about landscapes, and we've heard a lot about landscape approach, we also have to think about there are other aspects to the landscape in addition to connectivity for wildlife, that there are people in the landscape, and in this particular landscape there are a lot of people, and people with real nutritional needs, real livelihood needs, heavily dependent on the forest. How can we think about a landscape approach which incorporates the aspirations for people living in the landscape, in addition to our aspirations for conservation in the landscape? So part of that is thinking about topics that we might not ordinarily think about as conservationists, like what types of crops to grow, which are the crops that could provide the nutrition for people and also be climate resilient. How do we think about a landscape approach which includes these important ecosystem services, which is providing nutrition for people who have currently a lot of food insecurity? Another issue is water. This landscape is a water tower for several important rivers that feed downstream urban areas and supply water for irrigation, which is increasing rapidly in this landscape. How do we think about a landscape approach which combines the conservation needs, the nutritional needs for people, and the watershed protection in these upper reaches of the watershed? So currently there's a lot of water stress in this landscape, which is only poised to increase as irrigation increases more and more. Currently, there's not that much irrigation. It's largely rain-fed, but you can see with development and focus on increasing agricultural output and intensification, which needs to happen, irrigation is going to increase. So how do we combine all of these different issues when we think about a landscape approach? And finally, how do we use our tools? Probably one of the most useful things that we do as scientists is to just monitor, is just to suss out what's happening and how do we monitor the situation. So one of the big issues in this landscape as well is forest degradation, where local people are highly dependent on forest products for their livelihoods. This is an aspect of poverty. And how can we're using our remote sensing tools to try to monitor that, but also to try to understand what are the factors that are contributing to this forest degradation. We're finding that cattle grazing is quite a big impact on this, on the condition of the forest. So we have these science, we have our papers, we publish, we do our research. We've talked about this a lot during the last couple of days. Well, so what? What do we do with all that? How do we bring this whole different aspects of the landscape into some way that could actually feed into decisions? And there it gets really hard, because it's easy to sit down with your friends and sit down with your colleagues and sit down with people who share your values and talk about these issues. When you sit down with people who don't share your values, that think that economic growth at all costs is the priority, then it gets a lot harder. But that's where the real value comes, and that's where our science can slowly, but hopefully steadily, make some kind of difference. So this is another aspect that we're trying in this landscape, and this is kind of a science experiment also to see how this works through a program called SNAP, Science for Nature and People, which is precisely aimed at doing exactly that, getting the stakeholders in the room and different, varied stakeholders, and synthesizing the science in a way that the stakeholders who you might not ordinarily talk to, the highway authority, the mining companies, the people who are making the real decisions, to engage them in the process. And also, how do we have the basic dialogue between the research side and the people who can make use of the research results, like forest managers and other people who are working in the landscape? And for this, we've started a kind of a very informal but active network, and just pull these people together. Start talking. Just start the dialogue. We're not sure exactly where it'll go, but get the dialogue going. So we pulled this together a couple of years ago, and we're doing it again in December. So what I wanted to do here was invite any of you who are interested in this Central India landscape, and I've met a couple of people who I didn't know before working in this landscape, to be part of this network, and we're all in this together. We don't have a solution. We just know that this is a very globally important landscape for tiger conservation. There are real livelihood needs in this landscape, and we need to put all of this understanding together to move forward and be helpful in thinking through what this landscape might look like in the future, and see if a Disney happy ending story can come out of it. So, to sum up, just to try to pull back from some basic maybe points or messages or some things that I've pulled out of this last couple of days, is that this new prosperity, which is all for the good, is really the new context for conservation. We have to admit it, that lack of development and poverty has been somewhat of a de facto conservation in the past. And those times are gone, and they should be gone, because a lot of people are enjoying a lot more prosperity, and that is good. But it does fundamentally change the way that we think about conservation and urbanization and landscapes and design of landscapes to provide for people living with more prosperity. We've also, as I said, learned really hard lessons that just saying no, just opposing, is just a way to marginalize conservation. So that's a hard-learned lesson. And also that conservation really is about development and really is about prosperity and making people's lives better. So to the extent that we think about conservation and its effectiveness, it's really the most effective if we can also address or incorporate issues around human health, issues around development, issues that people care about. And conservation is not another issue out to the side, separate from these other really important human concerns, but part of the whole process towards prosperity and better lives for everyone. And also, as I said, really what we have, our bread and butter, is that we have facts, we can provide evidence, we can track what's happening in the world, and that is not always helpful, and often evidence and facts don't seem to make any difference whatsoever, because, as Mark Twain said, people use facts like statistics like a drunk uses a lamppost more for illumination than support. That often happens, but we have to stay at it, because if we don't have the evidence and the facts, then we are sure to not be successful. So there are lots of collaborators and lots of funders and people that I couldn't list here, some are listed here, that bring such different perspectives and such different experiences, working with nutritionists all the way to atmospheric modelers. And while sometimes that makes me feel a little bit scattered, I think there's a lot to be gained from working from these very, very different perspectives. And again, to thank you, and particularly to thank the organizers for this absolutely wonderful and inspiring conference. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have time for a few questions. David.
Ruth, I recognize that India is massively different from North America, but when I worked for various North American environmental organizations, I always wanted to have a few people to my left saying no to make me look reasonable. Is there a similar function for naysayers in the context of Central India conservation?
Yeah, I certainly see the point of having someone who's always on the no side. The way the situation, and those of you who work in Central India, chime in and correct me if I'm wrong, the way the situation is developed in Central India, that saying no is just a guarantee to be ignored at this point.
We have a question there.
Hi, thank you very much for coming and for your wonderful talk. I have a question about the first part of your talk. And so the need for facts and evidence is something that I very much agree with, and it's something that resonates deeply. At the same time, it's really important to have a complete picture. So I had read some studies that showed quite convincingly that, in fact, the biggest driver of deforestation in Southeast Asia is fiber, pulp paper fiber. And I was wondering, you gave us the breakdown of the 31%, but the other 69%, if you had a sense of what was going on there and what then happened, because it's important to know not just what was there before, but then what had happened, what the land got converted into after. Because if you think about it, if areas are cleared for timber, fiber, pulp, paper, and then burned and then converted into oil palm, that would be completely consistent with the data that you showed.
Yeah, so so this is just for Sumatra and Kalimantan, so I can't speak for all of the tropics. But in terms of the contribution of plantations as a whole, it's you can see the statistics there. So it's really a little bit frustrating, this sort of catch-all non-forest category, because you don't really know what that is. So that can include smallholders and degraded areas and undeveloped areas and all kinds of grassland types of areas. So it's a little bit frustrating not to know that. But to the extent that we can trace that, we can pull it apart into the types of plantations. And we did a little bit of Google Earth work to look at this question about how much of the timber plantations turn over into oil palm, because I think someone mentioned this in one of the sessions, that because oil palm is so incredibly lucrative, that's quite an important trend. And it certainly is the case in some of the concessions that we found, although not the dominant case.
Right, just wanted to draw your attention to that category of degraded can be very tricky, because once primary forest has been converted, it's very easy to call it degraded and then convert it into something else.
Yeah, yeah. So every landscape is very complicated and dynamic. This landscape is particularly complicated.
Pia had a question there.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Pia Parolin. I work at the Amazon, this nice black spot where you don't have this much infrastructure in paradise. Well, if I think back of the happy ending in the Disney story, the tiger gets chased away, it disappears, and Mowgli goes to live in a city. So I was wondering, well, at least in the original book, I think the new movie.
I think Disney might have changed that.
Yeah. So my question is about people moving to urbanization. To what extent do you think the people will maintain the connection to nature? Will education improve their conservation concern compared to the rural people who still live really connected? What is your perspective like in the long term, just as idea?
Well, now I'm just speaking from personal experience and not from analysis or science, but that when people become urbanized, their conceptualization of nature completely changes. First, they're not dependent on nature for their daily, they're not interacting with nature for their daily needs, directly, although they are, of course, but not directly. And they go to a grocery store, they turn on the tap. They're not directly interacting with nature, so that often they can romanticize nature in a way that people who live every day with nature, don't do. But it completely changes the way landscapes are organized. So now if you think about how urbanization is playing out, by the middle of the century, as Rini told us, 75% of people are going to be living in urban areas, which means the rural areas are, much of what the rural areas are supplying is commodities for people to consume in urban areas. So less and less, and we're already seeing this, that less and less do we have rural populations which are, completely subsistence, very few completely subsistence people left in the world, and more their livelihoods are linked with the city. So that might change their view of nature as well, that it's supplying their livelihood that is feeding people or supplying commodities that people are consuming. So, sort of everyone gets on the grid one way or the other, even if they're still in rural areas in this highly urbanized world that we're headed towards. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. People move to cities because they have job opportunities, or they have access to schools or clinics that they wouldn't have in rural areas. But it's a complete transformation of the way we, as a species, relate to nature.
Yeah, Ruth, thank you for the nice talk and everything. It's based on something we discussed earlier. One thing about the fires is that the fact that the fire is not in a plantation doesn't mean that they didn't cause it. Because they're unitary hydrological domes, if you drain your plantation, you're resulting in drainage everywhere else. So a lot of the fires that we're seeing now, which are outside of the plantations, are the legacy of the land use change that the plantations have created. So it's difficult. The plantations are part of the solution, but they have also been one of the main drivers of that, and I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it was so interesting to talk to you about the fires that occur that aren't related to land use. That was fascinating. So my student Megan did another analysis that I didn't show here about escape fires. So another myth that goes around, I think it's largely a myth, is that fires are caused by somebody else. So if there's a fire in a concession, it's the people outside of the fire, outside the concession that caused that local fire moved into the concession. If the fire is outside of the concession, it's the fault of the concession. So that fire started, and it's like blamed like this. But what she found, she traced the path of fires, is that these escape fires in either direction don't happen, they do happen, but they don't happen all that often. So everyone's responsible for a large majority of their own fires. But that doesn't address the really important point that you brought up about the hydrology, about any agriculture changing the hydrology, which would change the susceptibility to fire. So thanks.
One last question.
Sorry, you already answered this about the escape fire, so.
Last question.
Thank you for your talk, very interesting. I'm just curious to know, you speak about development in a very positive way, and I work in India. I wanted to ask you if you factor in corruption at all. Of course we need roads, of course we need highways and railway lines, but a lot of determinants for development are who's making the money. It's not directly proportionate to what poor people need. So is that something you look at in your reconciliation or your sort of, when you're studying land use change, do you factor in corruption and sort of these obfuscated reasons?
Yeah, not directly, although yes, it's a very big, corruption is a very big driver of what projects get funded, so it's the projects that make a lot of money for the contractors that get funded. The roads in this central India landscape, that's not really about, as I understand it, not really about providing mobility and development for the local population. That's a national need to just have highways and trucks that can cross the whole country. So I think there, maybe it will bring some benefit to local people, but that's not, as I understand it, really the intention for that highway development. But certainly your point is very well taken, that this infrastructure is related to what can But that's not to say, we can say that, but I mean, the U.S. developed with a highway system in the 1950s. I mean, every country that has gone through the process of development needs the infrastructure. So we can say it's associated with corruption, but the reality is that countries do need it.
Please join me to thank Ruth for a fantastic presentation.